I'm Joyce Meyer, and I believe that God can heal you everywhere you hurt.
Joyce Meyer is 83 years old, and she is still standing in front of arenas telling a story she kept to herself for roughly 40 years. It has nothing to do with the jet, the salary, or the Senate committee that once wrote to her. It goes back to a small house in South St. Louis, to a soldier home from the Second World War, to a daughter born the day he left, and to 18 years her mother spent in the same rooms.
My father, whom I was supposed to be able to trust, who was supposed to keep me safe, raped me a minimum of 200 times.
Waited until the seats were full before she said any of it. The question is why, and what she chose to do with him afterwards. The girl from South St. Louis. She was born Pauline Joyce Hutchison in South St. Louis, Missouri, on the 4th of June, 1943. Her father left for the war the day she was born. Everything she has said publicly about her childhood begins with the moment he came back. Joyce Meyer says her father sexually abused her from her childhood until she was 18 years old. She has put that in her books, said it from platforms, and repeated it in interviews for decades. She has been careful about what she does and does not describe, and the weight in her telling never comes from detail. It comes from arithmetic, 18 years, one house, a door that opened. A mother, she says, who understood that something was badly wrong in her own home and did not stop it. Picture the ordinary furniture of that childhood. A working-class street on the south side, a kitchen table, school in the morning, a mother moving through the same small rooms. Nothing about it looked like anything from the outside. That is the part she has returned to more than any other, because it taught her the lesson that shaped the next 20 years of her life. Adults could not be relied upon. Safety was something other children had. Here is what makes the rest of this story strange, and it is worth subscribing now to see how it plays out, because for 4 decades she built an empire on top of that silence and told the world nothing. She left the house the way a lot of young women left difficult homes in the early 1960s. She graduated from O'Fallon Technical High School and married almost immediately to a part-time car salesman. She has said the marriage lasted 5 years and that her husband cheated on her repeatedly. She has also said something no publicist would ever draft for a preacher. She has said he persuaded her to steal payroll checks from her employer, that the two of them spent the money on a trip to California, and that she paid it back years later. A young woman who had learned she was worth nothing had married a man who proved the point and then made her a thief on the way to the coast. 5 years is long enough to learn that the escape did not work. She had married at 18, straight out of a technical high school, into rented rooms and a husband who sold cars part-time, and the arrangement she had imagined as a rescue turned out to be the same arrangement she had run from, wearing a different face. Divorce in the mid-60s carried a stigma that is easy to underestimate now. She was in her early 20s, back in St. Louis, with a failed marriage behind her, no money, and a childhood she had told nobody about. The next man through the door had a slide rule and a steady job, and he is the reason there is a story at all. The draftsman and the drive. Dave Meyer was an engineering draftsman. They married on the 7th of January, 1967. By her own account, he was the first person who did not flinch at how difficult she was, and she has been unusually blunt about that period, describing herself in the early years of the marriage as blunt, selfish, and rude. She has never presented that as charming. She has presented it as the residue of the house in South St. Louis, arriving in a marriage that had done nothing to deserve it. They raised 4 children on an ordinary income. She went to church. She read her Bible. To anyone watching from the pew behind, she was a Missouri housewife whose life had finally settled into something manageable. Then came 1976. She was driving to work early one morning, alone in the car, and she says she heard God speak her name. That is the account she has given for 50 years, in essentially the same words, and she has never once softened it into metaphor or hedged it into a feeling. What followed was slow rather than sudden. It started with a Bible class before work, the kind held early enough that people arrive with wet hair and coffee in a room with folding chairs and no microphone. She became associate pastor at Life Christian Center, a charismatic church in Fenton, Missouri. Word of mouth did the rest. Women kept coming, and it was not because she sounded like a seminary lecture. She talked about rage. She talked about self-loathing. She talked about wanting to throw things at her husband. The rooms got bigger because she was describing the inside of their heads and refusing to be polite about it. In 1985, she left the church to found her own organization, Life in the Word. 20 years later, a newspaper 11 miles from her front door would start counting what came in. The machine she built television was the multiplier. Her program, later renamed Enjoying Everyday Life, went from regional slots to international networks, translated into dozens of languages. Conferences followed the broadcasts, filling arenas across North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Then came the books, more than 100 titles, with Battlefield of the Mind, published in 1995, becoming the one people quote back to her in supermarket queues. It has sold in the millions. Part of why it worked is that it was not written like theology. Battlefield of the Mind is a manual about intrusive thoughts, self-sabotage, and the internal voice that tells a person they are ruined beyond repair. Read now, with what she has since disclosed about that house in mind, the book reads differently on every page. She was not describing a doctrine. She was describing her own head, and she was doing it 15 years before she would give the audience the reason. The ministry built a humanitarian arm to match: disaster relief, orphan care, clean water projects, feeding programs, medical outreach, anti-trafficking work. Supporters point to that record as the answer to every criticism that followed. Critics point out that scale is not the same as accountability. Both things were true at once. By the early 2000s, the organization employed hundreds of people and operated in dozens of countries. It was also a family concern, with a board chaired by Joyce Meyer herself and her husband serving as vice president. That arrangement is legal. It is also the exact arrangement that makes an investigative reporter reach for the public records. The $23,000 commode. In November 2003, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the major newspaper in Meyer's own city, published a 4-part investigation into her ministry's finances. It is difficult to overstate how much of the next 20 years of criticism traces back to those articles. The paper reported the ministry was taking in an average of $8 million a month, and that roughly 10% of that went to charitable work overseas. It cataloged a $10 million corporate jet, a $2 million home for Joyce and Dave, houses worth around $2 million more for their 4 children, and a $107,000 Mercedes sedan. Then it went inside the headquarters. A $20 million building furnished with what the paper put at $5.7 million of furniture, artwork, and equipment. A $30,000 malachite table. An $11,000 French clock. And the item that outlived every other detail in the series: a $23,000 marble-topped antique commode. The word did the damage. A commode, in the antiques trade, is a low chest of drawers. Half of America heard a $23,000 toilet, and that version traveled further and faster than any correction ever could. The ministry later said the piece was furniture, not plumbing, and that it had not paid for it. Her defenders made a serious argument, and it deserves stating properly. A ministry running daily television, international conferences, and relief operations in dozens of countries is not a village chapel, and comparing the two is a category error. Aircraft move crews and equipment on schedules commercial aviation cannot serve. Assets held by the organization are not personal wealth. Executive pay at large nonprofits reflects the scale of the job. Meyer did not hide behind any of it. Her answer was blunter than her spokesman's, and it became the line she is quoted on more than any other. There is no need for her to apologize for being blessed. She pointed to Abraham, David, and Solomon. She argued the test is how money is earned and used, not whether a preacher has any. 2 years later, the paper went further. In 2005, documents obtained under Missouri's open records laws, filed during a dispute over the headquarters' tax-exempt status, showed the board had agreed to pay Joyce Meyer a $900,000 annual salary in 2002 and 2003, and Dave Meyer $450,000 in each of those years. A ministry spokesman, Mark Sutherland, said the earlier investigation had already prompted her to cut her pay, and that she was then taking $250,000. Whatever else that concession was, it was an admission that the coverage had landed. 2 years after that, the questions arrived on headed notepaper from Washington. The Senate letter. In November 2007, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, then the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, wrote to 6 media-based ministries. The other names were Kenneth and Gloria Copeland, Benny Hinn, Creeflo and Taffy Dollar, Eddie Long, and Randy and Paula White. The 5th letter went to David and Joyce Meyer. It is worth pausing on what that document was. A letter from the United States Senate itemizing, among the compensation figures and housing allowances and credit card statements, an antique chest of drawers. 2 distinctions matter here, and most retellings collapse them. First, an inquiry is not an indictment. Grassley was demanding transparency from tax-exempt bodies, not alleging crimes. Second, the 6 ministries did not respond alike. Joyce Meyer Ministries complied in full, across a series of filings. In March 2009, it joined the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, the independent body that audits Christian organizations against governance and disclosure standards, and Grassley publicly welcomed the move. On the 6th of January 2011, committee staff released a 61-page review closing the 3-year inquiry. It found that Meyer and Hinn had complied, engaged constructively, and undertaken reforms it described as extensive and to be commended, some of them begun before the inquiry started. The other 4 ministries provided incomplete responses, or none. No penalties were issued against anyone. Every one of those years, she was answering questions about furniture. Not one of them was about the house she grew up in. The things that happened around her. In May 2009, Christopher Coleman, the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, murdered his wife and their 2 young sons at their home in Columbia, Illinois. Meyer was never accused of anything, though she testified at his trial because of his position in the organization. He was convicted in 2011 and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without parole. In July 2024, she withdrew from a speaking engagement at Gateway Church in Texas after its founder, Robert Morris, admitted inappropriate sexual behavior with a minor. A spokesperson said the decision reflected her opposition to abuse. Then, in January 2025, she pulled Enjoying Everyday Life from the Daystar television network, ending a partnership that had run since 2005. Investigative journalist Julie Roys had reported in autumn 2024 that Daystar president Joni Lamb was accused by her son and daughter-in-law of covering up abuse against their 5-year-old granddaughter, an allegation Lamb has repeatedly denied. Daystar said it expected the claims to be disproven. The email announcing the withdrawal was written by her son, Dan Meyer, the ministry's chief executive. He wrote that they were troubled by the allegations. Then he gave a second reason, and it is the reason that explains everything the Arenas had been hearing for years. He referred to his mother's own story. What she actually says. There is a detail in the timing that is easy to miss. She did not lead with any of this. When the Bible class was still meeting before work, when the ministry was founded in 1985, when the television program first crossed a border, the story stayed inside the family. She was a woman teaching other women how to survive their own thoughts without telling them where she had learned it. The disclosure came gradually, in books and then from platforms, at exactly the point in her career when she had the most to lose from it. Public figures are usually advised to do the opposite. Disclose early when nobody is listening, or never. She did it once the arenas were full. She has been as direct about the aftermath as about the fact. Rage, a terror of being left. A conviction that she was worth nothing and had to earn every scrap of affection she ever got. And a pattern she says she could not see at the time. A girl taught she is worthless will accept a husband who cheats on her and asks her to steal, because it confirms what she already believes. Wounded people, in her phrasing, make wounded choices. Then there is the part that unsettles people on both sides of every argument about her. She forgave him, not privately, not abstractly, and not at a safe distance. In her own account, she and Dave supported her parents financially. They bought them a house near their own, close enough to walk to, which meant she chose to live within sight of the man for the rest of his life. She visited. She looked after both of them into old age, into the frailty and the appointments and the ordinary indignities of it. And the woman doing the caring was the child from those 18 years. Her father eventually admitted what he had done. Not in a courtroom, not to a reporter, and not under any pressure the world would recognize as pressure. It came at the end of a long life, lived a short walk from the daughter he had harmed, after years of her turning up anyway. He was baptized as an old man, at the end of a life in which the only person who had reason to abandon him had not. She has never once dressed that up as the abuse mattering less. She has been explicit that the forgiveness was not for his benefit, and that she was not willing to spend the rest of her life governed by a man who had already taken her childhood. And in 2019, she did something else that the coverage of her finances almost never mentions. She publicly recanted a large part of the faith teaching that made her famous, saying it had got out of balance, that she and others had ended up telling people every problem in their life traced back to a shortage of faith. If you got sick, you did not have enough faith. If your child died, you did not have enough faith. She said plainly that this was wrong. Both of those admissions carried a cost. Neither was forced by a newspaper, a senator, or a lawsuit. At 83, she is still working. She is scheduled in Tulsa in August 2026 and in Tampa on the 22nd and 23rd of October for the 44th Annual Love Life Women's Conference. The program still airs daily on other networks and platforms. The books are still being reprinted. It is worth being precise about what has and has not changed. She has never conceded that the aircraft were indefensible. She has never returned a salary or retracted the line about not apologizing for being blessed. The reforms that closed the Senate review were structural ones about governance and disclosure, and the accreditation that came with them is an audit, not an absolution. Critics inside evangelicalism argued for years that prosperity teaching is incompatible with the New Testament, and her partial retraction in 2019 did not persuade them that the earlier decades had been repaired. Anyone expecting the 83-year-old version of her to renounce the last 40 years will be waiting a long time. What she has conceded is narrower and arguably harder, that a teaching she had built a career on was hurting the people who believed it, and that her own father did something to her that most families take to the grave. That is why it lands the way it does with the women who fill those arenas. Most of them did not come for a position on nonprofit governance. They came because a woman at the front of the room said the worst thing that ever happened to her out loud, and then said it did not get to decide how the rest of it went. Hit subscribe if this changed how you see her, and drop a comment telling me whether you think the woman or the ministry is the real story here. And do not miss the video on your screen right now.